So that is one intense passage, isn't it, that Sarah has laid on us this morning. The words of the prophet Jeremiah to the people of Israel. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, and now you know why. Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for my people. The Hebrew prophets were a remarkable group of people, mostly men, but the Tanakh says at least 7 women and probably more. The way we think of prophecy now is really kind of exclusively in the foretelling of the future. And while the original prophets did predict the future, and the truth of what they said was kind of was very much dependent upon what they said coming true, the prophets are more to be understood as the voice of moral conscience for the nation, speaking on behalf of God or in the words of God to the ways Israel had fallen away from God and God's purposes and God's laws. The prophets were the original speakers of truth to power, and it was never very pleasant for them. Speaking truth to power never is. Poor Jeremiah was one of the more tortured of the prophets, required by God to ignite the flame of moral conscience of kings and rulers and people in power who frankly were at the top of the heap by ignoring their moral conscience. Jeremiah was called by God as a teenager, and like many of the prophets was like, no thanks. And God was like, yes, thank you. And so began his miserable career as a prophet of God. And we learn by reading the book of Jeremiah that he was cursed by crowds, that he was beaten and arrested, that he was nearly lynched, that he was thrown into a cistern, that he was tortured, that his hometown friends came to hate him so much that they tried to assassinate him. Remember Jesus saying a prophet is never welcome in his hometown? That was what he was pointing back to, one of the moments. And you might think, well, at least he was close to God and all of that, but that really wasn't so great either, that relationship. He accused God of lying to him and failing him, saying that God, who was once a fountain of living water, has become to me no better than a deceitful brook. Thanks for nothing, God. And he became so utterly depressed that he cursed his own birthday. So all of that is in the book of Jeremiah, as well as these beautiful moments of hope and promise, but a lot of the despair. So you can understand why he was called, poor thing, the weeping prophet. And now you can also be grateful that God has not called you to be a prophet. It was a particularly dire time in Israel's history when Jeremiah came on the scene, so he wasn't the only miserable person there. He was called by God in 627 BCE, at a time when Assyria was one oppressive empire dominating Israel, was being crushed by Babylon to become an even more oppressive empire of Israel. Who eventually destroyed the capital city, Jerusalem, in 587, and the grand edifice that marked God's presence there in Jerusalem, which was what? Solomon's temple. It sat in ruins at the center of everything. This was particularly devastating because Solomon's temple was a glorious monument to the God of Israel, a place of worship and sacrifice and devotion where the people were reminded of God's wisdom and God's righteousness, God's justice and God's holiness, and where they were reminded to be that themselves, just and holy, wise and righteous. So when this temple was destroyed, it was a devastation beyond comparison for them. And Jeremiah spoke his prophecies just before it all went down, just before Babylon came in and crushed them, predicting it would happen. As Babylon was first coming on the scene, Jerusalem foresaw the destruction about to befall Israel. And what he proclaimed was that this tragedy was going to befall them for two primary reasons. One, because of their idolatry, their turning away from God to other gods. And two, because of the injustices running rampant in their nation. The prophets were always hitting these two things, idolatry and injustices and idolatry. It mattered to God how they treated one another, especially the most vulnerable. And unless Israel changed their ways and turned humbly back to God, they were going to be in a world of hurt. The bottom line of judgment from God to them, quoted by Jeremiah, "My people, their evil deeds have no limit. They do not seek justice or promote the cause of the fatherless or defend the cause of the poor, and destruction will come." And he says, "As you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your own land, so now will you serve foreigners in a land not your own." And sure enough, the hurt came at the hands of Babylon, who first crushed them, then destroyed the temple, then exiled them from the land, just as miserable Jeremiah had predicted. And Jeremiah wept for his people, the weeping prophet, because he took no joy in this message he had to deliver. He wept out of compassion. As harsh as his words were about Israel's sins, his prophecy came from a place of love for his people who did not understand what they did. "Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, horror grips me." Again, does that sound familiar? 600 years later, Jesus would look over Jerusalem just before another great destruction, this time at the hands of Rome, and weep that they didn't understand what would make for peace. But Jeremiah, well before that, speaks one of his most famous lines as he has this vision of his people being destroyed by Babylon. He says, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why is there no healing for the wound of my people?" The disciples, after Jesus' death and resurrection, as they're grappling with words to how to name what has just happened and what they're experiencing in the resurrection, they look back on Jeremiah's words and say, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what Jeremiah was referring to. This is the balm in Gilead. The one come to heal the wound of my people and our sin-sick souls. It's Jesus, the resurrected Christ. He called people towards justice and righteousness and holiness. He spoke truth to power. He wept over our nation. He healed people physically, emotionally, communally, spiritually. And then when he was executed, like all the prophets before him and since them tend to be, he alone was resurrected, and his followers experienced this remarkable kind of transmigration of God's Spirit that dwelt in Solomon's temple walls, a spirit of wisdom and righteousness, justice and holiness, and that moved the locusts of the temple into their own hearts through the Spirit of Jesus. And they began to believe that their lives, drawn together as the church, became the new temple of God's Spirit. And they wanted to live the way of wisdom and righteousness, justice and holiness, and in that way be a healing balm themselves for the world. That's what they understood their purpose to be. And that is the call for us, Jesus followers that we are today, Jesus' church. Call of the prophets to be a presence of healing and care, to be a voice calling for justice when we see injustice in our nation and world, and a force of resistance against idolatry. And that's a tricky one, because the prophets hit this very hard, this idolatry. And we Christians aren't necessarily tempted to bow down before golden calves and graven images, hoping to gain favors and sacrificing our children to them, as they did in the cultures that tempted Israel. But this doesn't mean that we don't have our own idolatries, our own idols, right? Does it? Our own idolatries. I mean, we can have a near religious devotion, for instance, to the invisible hand of the market. That's where we put our trust in the future more than in God's providence. And it could be argued that we feed our children to the jaws of a uniquely American beast, which is this devotion to individuality and competition that values them based upon wealth and success over generosity and service. And there's an idolatrous nationalism, you could say, among us that would make the prophets cry out. A devotion to country which says America is God's country, the greatest nation on earth. And it's a country run and dominated largely by white people. And there's as much weight on the symbol of the flag as any of us Christians place upon the cross. And while there's no religious practice of child sacrifice per se, there is in our country a bizarre religious, I won't even say near religious, religious devotion to the Second Amendment, isn't there? That accepts even death of children in its unwillingness to bend. And there is the caging and deporting of innocent children that we've seen over the years from other lands that the authorities feel like they have to do to protect our own citizens, and the flying of them from one state to another as pawns in political machinations. It's shameless, shameless. I can't imagine the prophets wouldn't cry out against such shameless things, setting our own gain against that of God's beloved children. It all suggests that there are deep and dangerous idolatries among us that hold sway in our lives, and that we are far less liberated than we believe ourselves to be. But we come into our churches and hear the voice of the prophets time and time and time again, crying in the wilderness. We hear the voice of our prophet, Jesus, crying in the wilderness, crying over Jerusalem, crying over America in many ways. For this bottom line, one of justice for the oppressed, kindness to the foreigner, care for the most vulnerable, eschewing of violence and its weapons, caring for the burning land. And we hear the prophets cry that there is a deeper sickness among us than we know. That's what the prophets have to tell people. There's a deeper sickness among us than we know that needs serious attention, that needs a physician and a balm for the healing of our people, for the healing of our daughters of the land. Is there no balm for the healing of this land? Where are the humble who bow down seeking wisdom and strength from the Lord? The prophet says. Where are those who insist that justice and holiness join at the feet of God? Where are those who are temples of God's Spirit, who are giving their life, their breath, for the sake of healing and restoration, forgiving and blessing? Where are those who are dwelling in Solomon's walls?